what if I told you that the reason millions of Australians are currently completely locked out of the housing market isn't just because of a sudden, post-pandemic spike in immigration?
Right. Yeah, it's so easy to just point to that.
Exactly. But what if the real underlying reason is that over the last 30 years, our construction industry has actually gotten significantly worse at building things?
It's a staggering reality to confront, honestly. I mean, you look at almost every other sector of the Australian economy over the last 3 decades, and you see these massive leaps in efficiency,
But
right?
absolutely, technology changes everything.
Yeah, but residential construction has effectively moved backward. It's created this structural fragility that is just, well, it's buckling under pressure right now.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking directly into the mechanics of the Australian housing crisis, sitting here in April 2026.
And it is a crisis.
It really is. For a lot of you listening to this, the great Australian dream probably feels like it's been entirely walled off.
Yeah, permanently out of reach.
Right. So to set the scene, we need to look at the baseline numbers from the 2025 State of the Housing System report. Just to give you an idea of the sheer scale we are dealing with here.
The numbers are pretty grim.
Very grim. In 2024, across the entire country, only about 177,000 homes were built. But the underlying demand for that same period was around 223,000.
So we're starting from a massive deficit right off the bat.
Exactly. And rent vacancy is stuck below 2.5%. And if you are trying to buy in a place like Sydney, homes are now costing 10 times the average income. 10 times.
It's a compounding deficit. Yeah. We're dealing with a system that has historically treated housing primarily as an investment asset.
Instead of just, a place to live.
Exactly, rather than basic shelter.
Yeah.
And now that long-term structural failure is colliding head-on with a massive short-term demand shock.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because that demand shock is usually the very first thing that makes the evening news, right?
Oh yeah, the immigration headlines.
Right. We had a huge post-pandemic population boom.
Right.
The data shows that between 2023 and 2025, the population grew by 1.5 million people.
Which is astronomical for us.
It's huge. And it was driven heavily by overseas migration. We're talking over 518,000 people in the 2023 financial year alone.
Right.
So it's really easy to just point the finger at immigration and say, well, there's your problem. But looking through the source material for this deep dive, I started to realize there is a much bigger story about how we are actually living.
Yeah, the demographic shifts occurring internally are, I would argue, reshaping the landscape just as much as raw population growth.
Really, just from how we live.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The actual composition of the Australian household is changing. Families are getting smaller, and we are seeing a significant sustained rise in single and double person households.
Oh, right. And then you add the work from home era on top of that. The way we use our homes has fundamentally changed. Like, if you are a single professional working 3 days a week from your living room, you suddenly need a dedicated home office.
You can't just work from the kitchen table forever.
Well, you can't. So that means you are taking up a 2-bedroom apartment instead of the 1-bedroom you might have rented, say, 5 years ago.
And this creates what the think tanks call a spatial squeeze.
A spatial squeeze. I like that term.
Yeah, the Grattan Institute points out that the physical demand for housing space is far outstripping simple population growth.
Because everyone just wants more room.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you also have young Australians who are being forced to delay their independence.
Oh, because the baseline costs are just so high.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They aren't moving out or buying as early as previous generations did. They just can't afford it.
I want to tie this directly back to you, the listener, or the people you know, because this demand is just hypersensitive in inner and middle ring suburbs.
The places where everyone actually needs to be.
Exactly. These are the places where the jobs are, where the good schools are, and where the transit hubs are. And because of that concentrated demand, property prices in places like Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide have almost doubled since 2019.
Which is just, it's breathtaking when you think about it.
Doubled in like 7 years. This isn't abstract economics. This rising cost of living is physically forcing young families out.
They're being displaced.
Yeah, they're being pushed further and further away from the city hubs and the vital infrastructure they rely on every day.
And the human cost of that relocation is profound. It translates to increased daily commute times, less time spent with family, and a fracturing of established community networks.
You're ripped away from your support system.
Right. When young families are priced out of the areas they grew up in, it fundamentally alters the social fabric of those cities.
So we have this intense demand in these inner and middle ring areas. Logically, you would think the market would respond by simply building more housing where people actually want to live.
Supply meets demand, right?
That's economics 101. But we aren't doing that. And this brings us to what the think tanks identify as the absolute biggest structural barrier in this whole crisis, which is local planning laws.
The physical constraints placed on the land itself.
Yeah, I was reading through the zoning regulations in the reports, and the best way I can think to describe our local planning laws is it's like a bouncer at a half-empty club.
Okay, I like this.
Right, so there is a massive line of people outside freezing. There's plenty of room inside the venue, but the bouncer just crosses his arms and says, sorry, default is no.
Our state and territory planning systems heavily rely on that exact mentality. They default to no and approve only by exception.
It's madness.
The data detailing how this works in practice is startling. Within a 30-kilometer radius of Sydney's center, 80% of residential land is legally restricted to buildings under 3 stories.
Wait, hold on. 80%.
80%.
That is incredible. 80% of the land in a massive global metropolis is essentially capped at a 2-story house.
In Melbourne, it's even worse, actually. It's 87%.
Wow!
Yeah. And in cities like Brisbane and Perth, over 3/4 of the land is restricted to under 2 stories.
It's like we're pretending these aren't major cities.
Exactly. And when you combine those strict height caps with rules around minimum lot sizes, heritage protections, and, setback requirements from the street,
It just becomes impossible.
increasing density in those high-demand middle rings becomes almost legally impossible.
Even if you manage to convince the bouncer to let you in, like, if you actually get permission, the delay is punishing.
Oh, the bureaucracy is famously slow.
Think about this for those listening. If you decide today to invest in building just 10 simple townhouses in Sydney or Melbourne, your money is going to sit in a council purgatory for an average of 250 days before you even see a shovel hit the dirt.
Nearly a year.
You are paying interest on a dirt patch for nearly a year.
And that delay translates directly into an inflated final price. The financial penalty of that red tape is severe. The reports show that every 6 months of delay adds about $18,700 to the cost of a single home.
And who pays for that?
Exactly. That cost gets passed directly onto the buyer or the renter. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains a massive historical shift we've seen in the Australian property market over the last few decades.
The actual underlying value of the property has completely flipped, hasn't it?
Yes. Back in 1990, the physical land made up about 50% of a property's total value, and the structure itself was the other 50%.
Which makes sense.
Today, the land makes up over 70% of a home's value.
Over 70%. So the house itself is almost an afterthought.
This is largely due to slow government land releases, coupled with the fact that the exorbitant cost of planning delays and local infrastructure are now heavily embedded in the price of the land itself.
Before a brick is even laid.
Right. The scarcity is literally manufactured by the zoning rules.
So we've essentially made it illegal to build enough homes in the places people want to live. But what blows my mind is that while we restrict the physical supply like that, our tax system is actively pouring gasoline on the financial demand.
Yeah, this is where it gets really complicated.
We need to look at the tax incentives, specifically things like negative gearing and the 50% capital gains tax discount.
Right.
Looking at this impartially based on the reports, negative gearing essentially allows investors to take the financial losses from an investment property and use them to shrink the taxable income from their day job.
It creates a fascinating, albeit market-distorting, behavior. It introduces a mechanism where losing money on a house is actually a viable government-supported tax strategy for an individual.
Which sounds crazy when you say it out loud.
It does. Along with the capital gains discount, it encourages investors to view housing primarily as a financial vehicle to park wealth rather than an essential service.
And that dynamic contrasts so sharply with the urgent societal need for just basic affordable rental options. Like, we are incentivizing capital growth for investors while the need for baseline shelter just goes unmet.
And while those private investment incentives grew substantially over the last 30 years, we've seen a dramatic historical trend in the exact opposite direction for public safety nets.
Oh, the social housing numbers. Yeah, I saw that.
Social housing plummeted from 6% of the total housing stock in 1991 to just 4% in 2021.
So the market shifted toward wealth generation at the exact same time the structural safety net was being dismantled.
Precisely.
Okay, so I'm looking at this data on spare bedrooms, and I have to admit I am incredibly confused. The sources note there are 4 million homes in Australia right now with spare bedrooms.
Empty nests, mostly.
Right. Logically, you'd think empty nesters, retirees whose kids have moved out, would cash out, sell the massive 4-bedroom family home, and buy a nice, accessible apartment in the exact same suburb.
That would be the efficient outcome, yes.
But the market is frozen. Why aren't they cashing out and freeing up that space for the young families who desperately need it?
It comes down to another massive structural barrier, the stamp duty trap.
Stamp duty.
Stamp duty acts as a massive upfront financial penalty for moving. Imagine a massive exit fee at a parking garage that is so expensive, people choose to just leave their cars parked there forever.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
If an empty nester wants to downsize, the stamp duty they have to pay on the new, smaller apartment can be tens of thousands of dollars.
Which completely destroys the financial logic of downsizing in the first place.
Exactly. They just look at the math and realize it's cheaper to stay in a mostly empty 4-bedroom house.
This is why major think tanks are heavily advocating for replacing upfront stamp duties with a broad-based land tax, right?
Yes. The evaluation from these think tanks is that a smaller annual land tax would remove that massive upfront penalty for moving.
So people could actually move when their life circumstances change.
It would greatly encourage mobility, allowing retirees to right-size their living situations without taking a huge financial hit.
Which subsequently frees up existing larger housing stock for the growing families that actually need those extra bedrooms.
Exactly.
That makes total sense. So we have a tax system pouring gasoline on demand, a zoning system choking the land supply, and stamp duty trapping people in homes that are too big for them.
That's a perfect storm.
But let's say we magically fix all of that tomorrow. Like we just wave a wand, rewrite the zoning laws, and replace stamp duty. We still hit a physical brick wall.
The physical reality.
Yeah, we literally do not have the people to build the houses.
The labor bottleneck.
Yeah.
It is arguably the most intractable part of this entire crisis.
The 2026 figures are just grim. We're short over 83,000 skilled tradies across the board.
83,000.
The reports cite a shortage of 22,000 carpenters, 17,000 electricians, and 12,000 plumbers. How does a shortage even get this extreme?
It is a compound failure that's been brewing for years. First, you have low apprenticeship completion rates.
Just people dropping out.
Yeah, often driven by cost of living pressures, pushing young people to abandon their training for immediate, higher-paying, unskilled work.
Oh, right, because they just need to pay rent today.
Exactly. Second, we have an aging workforce. The construction industry is naturally losing about 110,000 people each year to retirement.
Wow, so 110,000 people are leaving, and we're already short 83,000.
And then third, you have massive government infrastructure projects heavily cannibalizing the available labor pool.
Oh, right. The state governments are inadvertently competing with their own housing targets.
They really are.
You have the preparation for the Brisbane Olympics and Victoria's massive big build projects.
So much public spending.
If you are a commercial plumber, are you going to take a risky, weather-dependent residential job, or are you going to take a guaranteed union rate 5-year contract building a new underground rail network for the state government?
The choice is obvious. The residential building sector simply cannot compete with the public purse for top-tier talent.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. It's not just that we have fewer people. It's the 30-year decline in how effective we are at building.
This is the productivity issue.
Yeah, over the last 3 decades, overall productivity across the entire Australian economy rose by 49%. But in the construction industry, productivity actually declined.
Which is wild.
I was trying to wrap my head around this. Imagine if we still built cars by having 15 independent contractors drive their utes to your driveway to assemble a Toyota piece by piece over 6 months.
That's a great analogy.
That's essentially how we still build houses, right?
It is known as the productivity paradox in construction. And your car analogy highlights the exact mechanism at fault.
Okay.
Unlike manufacturing, which highly consolidated and automated its processes over the decades, the residential construction industry is incredibly fragmented.
It's all mom and pop shops.
Mostly, yes. It is primarily made up of thousands of small, independent subcontractors. A sole trader carpenter doesn't have the capital to invest in a $5 million prefab robotics facility.
No, of course not.
So this fragmentation makes it nearly impossible to scale up innovations. We've seen a remarkably slow adoption of new technologies, like digital materials tracking or modular factory-built housing.
While other industries revolutionize, residential construction is basically operating the exact same way it did in the 1990s.
Very little has changed.
So it takes forever to get permission, taxes distort the market, and we don't have an efficient labor force.
As if that domestic mess wasn't enough, we are now watching global events in 2026 just hammer the Australian housing market from the outside.
The extreme vulnerability of global supply chains.
Yes, we are looking at the 2026 conflict in Iran.
You're right.
That geopolitical crisis has triggered a massive spike in global oil and fuel prices, creating this almost COVID-style supply chain ripple effect all over again.
Sitting everywhere. But it's not just that things are generally more expensive. The specific material inflations are paralyzing new builds.
Because fuel prices dictate the cost of moving anything heavy, right?
Exactly.
So the flow-on effects into construction are immediate and brutal. Asphalt costs are up over 50%.
50%.
General transport and freight costs have surged 30%. Essential heavy materials like concrete and cement are up 10 to 15%.
Which you need for every single foundation.
And anything petroleum-based, like plastic and HDPE piping, has spiked by 28 to 36%.
So everything is just dramatically more expensive.
Suppliers are even slapping emergency fuel surcharges directly onto builders' invoices.
Think about what that means on the ground. You have a developer who signed a contract a year ago to build an apartment building. Suddenly, the global fuel spike causes their concrete and piping costs to explode.
It ruins their margins.
At the exact same time, the Reserve Bank of Australia is holding interest rates high to fight that very inflation.
Okay.
So the developer's financing is more expensive, and their materials are more expensive. They look at the spreadsheet and realize they simply cannot turn a profit.
The math breaks.
It totally breaks.
And that leads to immediate project cancellation.
Massive cancellations. And a terrifyingly high rate of construction company bankruptcies across the country. The homes just do not get built.
Which creates a vicious cycle. The supply shrinks even further, which pushes the underlying value of the existing homes even higher, locking more people out of the market and increasing the pressure on the rental sector.
We've diagnosed the patient, and it's a systemic failure on almost every conceivable level. So what does this all mean, and how do we actually fix it? What are the think tanks suggesting as a way out?
This raises an important question about political will versus practical reality.
Okay.
The consensus among think tanks, like the Grattan Institute, is that minor policy tweaks are completely insufficient at this point.
We're past the point of tinkering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For context, the government's National Housing Accord had a goal of building 1.2 million homes by 2029.
And how's that going?
As of early 2026, that target is already heavily off track. We need profound structural reform.
But how do state governments actually bypass the local blockades? We talked about the bouncer at the club, the local council blocking density, because local homeowners who don't want their neighborhoods to change vote for them.
The leading suggestion is that state governments need to forcefully take the clipboard away from the bouncer.
Oh, I like that.
They need to implement overarching national or state-level planning reforms specifically designed to fast-track medium-density housing.
Like townhouses.
Yes. We are talking about overarching mandates that legalize 3-story townhouses or low-rise apartment blocks near transit hubs.
Regardless of what the local council wants.
The state would essentially force the required upzoning in major metropolitan areas, making it a default yes for medium density, entirely bypassing the local council bottlenecks.
And what about the physical building process? Because we still have a massive shortage of tradespeople.
The solutions there require dragging construction into the 21st century. Think tanks are urging a rapid expansion of modular construction.
Meaning building them in factories.
Right, building large sections of homes in climate-controlled factories and assembling them on site.
So you don't have to worry about rain delays or coordinating 15 different independent contractors in a driveway.
Exactly. This bypasses the weather delays and greatly reduces the reliance on a fragmented, scarce skilled labor pool.
That makes a lot of sense.
Additionally, there is a strong push to commit to raising the social housing stock back up to between 6 and 10%.
Rebuilding the safety net.
We have to rebuild a true public safety net that isn't entirely reliant on private investors seeking capital gains.
It's just an incredible web to untangle. This crisis is a collision of soaring human demand, meaning a literal brick wall of outdated zoning laws, tax incentives that trap retirees in empty houses, a severe tradie shortage, a 30-year decline in building productivity, and 2026 global fuel shocks inflating the cost of basic concrete.
It is a highly complex ecosystem, but I think there is a deeper philosophical issue we have to confront if we are actually going to implement these structural reforms.
What's the ultimate trade-off here?
Well, we've spent this time discussing how the entire Australian system currently treats housing as a wealth-generating asset rather than basic shelter.
Yeah. Right.
But if these structural reforms actually work, if we successfully bypass councils, flood the market with medium-density housing, reform taxes, and make housing highly affordable again.
Which is the goal.
It is, but it inherently means flattening the property values that millions of everyday Australians are currently relying on for their retirement.
Oh, wow.
So are we, as a society, actually prepared to accept a future where a house is just a secure place to live rather than a guaranteed ticket to wealth?
That is the ultimate tension. Opening the doors to that half-empty club means the VIP section just isn't so exclusive anymore.
Exactly.
And lowering the cost of entry means the people already inside have to accept that their ticket isn't worth quite as much. That's a heavy thought for all of you to really mull over as these policies unfold.
It really is.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the 2026 housing landscape. Keep questioning the systems around you. We'll see you next time.